So I've been scouring the web to comb my way through the multiplayer landscape. It's a place where communities can be met. It's also a place of getting flamed, deranked, and in turn, yelling at other players. It's also an infinite pool of replayability and growing skill gaps that are increased by the presence of players. Whatever game you come across in the multiplayer scene, you'll always find a competitive side, and even if the game isn't designed with that approach, players themselves will find ways to be competitive with it. Even still, I've found a good chunk of games that can be played casually while still leaving the choice to be competitive, which is up to you really. I picked these games in the list largely because they are easy to pick up to play, they're easy to run and won't tank your PC. They also have a more casual environment to them in contrast to some of the more competitive games. Some of these games I've already talked about and some I've yet to cover and have yet to play, but I'm going to be talking about them anyways. I will be briefly going over each one and show what may or may not be for you. Some of these games may already have sweaty players or highly skilled players, but there's not a sliver of hope that you can do to mitigate that shit anyways, because, well, that's just the nature of some people in multiplayer. So, yeah, tough shit, I guess. Moving on, I'll start off immediately with a game that I've already talked about, and that is Red Match 2. Red Match 2 is a fast-paced arena-like shooter that gives you a grappling hook and 4 weapons to play around with. It uses servers for players to find or create matches like in the old days, and there's a variety of content in terms of game modes and maps. Movement is very fast and weapons feel pretty responsive. It has a dedicated community of people that you can regularly play with online, and the game is free as well. There's plenty of room for developing skill with the grappling hook, which is another thing to master on its own. But you can still play the game and just fuck around with it, while still getting some decent results. For someone that enjoys deathmatch-based modes, I felt right at home with this one, and because of the game not being pedestaled to just being another fucking esport, you generally have a more chill and casual environment to enjoy here. For those that love grappling hooks in their games and want something that is a mix of Quake and Call of Duty, give Red Match 2 a try. Next up is Paint Warfare, another game that I've also covered and also immensely enjoyed. Like Red Match 2, it's akin to other arena-based shooters while still, using its own spin on the table. Its gunplay is somewhat similar to COD, where you're not recoil controlling like in Counter-Strike or anything, but just spraying to your heart's content. It takes the idea of paintball and replaces the blood with paint, creating a world painted in paint. Anyway, I love the visual aesthetic of this game. The saturated and bright visuals that can be found in its visual design, the cute design of the characters. The weapons also feel good and look good, and it's mindless to the point where you can shoot easily, but also still requiring a bit of skill, on top of the movement, which in itself is pretty dynamic, compounded with the different abilities that your character can also use, making for interesting ways to move about or gain the upper hand on another player. I've made a video on this game, and I would recommend that you check it out for more information if you're interested. I'll also put a link for it, as well as other games I've already covered in the description. But to quickly summarize, it's a really fun arena-based shooter with some nice visuals, fun to use weapons, and finding a match is pretty easy because of the quick play option that you have. It's been a while since I've touched upon it, but sometime later on I may revisit Paint Warfare once again and see how it's developed. Definitely check this game out though. When it comes to weapon variety or the type of weapons you'll use, this game is a narrow one. Narrow One is a team-based multiplayer game that utilizes bows and crossbows, as well as melee weapons, giving it a more medieval-based multiplayer experience. All of the ranged weapons are projectile-based, and skill shotting is a thing in this game. Timing your shots based on where your opponents may go during fights is important. From a visual standpoint, I like the artistic approach to its low poly design. A lot of the games on this list, by the way, are low poly based, so keep that in mind. The maps and objects are pretty well defined, and the inclusion of additional skins gives players an incentive to keep playing. Each of the main weapons have a different feel to them and will require different levels of timing. However, you do also have the option to beat people's heads with a melee weapon if you want to make things a bit easier for yourself. On that token though, if you don't like using bows, then this is not the game for you because that is the main focus. Like a lot of other games on this video's list, it has a dedicated following. Guest players will often try this game out, and you also have content creators that play and promote the game too. It's a really fun game to play, and it's easy as hell to run. You can just find a browser game site or go on the main page and immediately start playing it. You just click to play and you're already queued into a match. Narrow One is the kind of game with a good amount of skill required, but is still easy enough to get a grasp on things straight away. Definitely give this one a try if you want a multiplayer game that's centered around archery. Now this one, on the other hand, is a classic. Soldat, one of the oldest games on this list and still one of the most enjoyable arena-based shooters that you can find. This game dates all the way back to the early 2000s and it uses a 2D space for its gameplay. It's a mix of Worms, Quake, Liero, which is another ancient game, and Counter-Strike put into a 2D blender. Tons of maps and weapons to use, and it also has bots for those that don't have internet but still want a multiplayer-like experience. It's a pretty chaotic game that can also be fun. It was also a game reflective of a time where esports wasn't really a thing in the West and developers weren't trying to make their own Overwatch League or LCS within their own game. Soldat is just simple fragging fun in 2D and nothing more. It can be a bit challenging, and there are some lifelong players on there, but it's not like you're fighting for prize money, and when you do manage to get a kill, it's pretty satisfying. For those that enjoy user-created content like me, this game also allows that so that you never run out of stuff to enjoy. If you want to experience an ancient piece of arena shooter history that isn't talked about as much, then give Soldat a try. Also, as an added bonus, I'll also add Soldat 2 into the mix, which is pretty similar except for the more polished visuals and gameplay. Battle Royale games are incredibly sweaty at times. Just look at the most popular ones. But Totally Accurate Battlegrounds is incredibly stupid just from its appearance. I have not actually played this one, by the way, but I still wanted to give points to it anyways because it seems to take a sweaty concept like Battle Royale and still manages to make fun of it while looking really fun to play. It's pretty similar to PUBG from the looks of it, but if it didn't take itself as seriously and the gameplay revolves around its own physics system. You'll constantly be wobbling around the place all the while trying to shoot everyone else, looking stupid while doing it. Its aesthetic comes from Landfall's own distinct design, which is shown in some of their other games like Totally Accurate Battle Simulator and Cluster Truck. It has a ton of weapons for you to play around with, or if you're the loner type, you're not forced to join a squad if you don't want to. However, it's not quite as popular as some of the other Battle Royales, and when you have a low population count for a Battle Royale game, it's harder to get into BR sessions because of how many players that they account for and how large the maps are in general. Last time I checked Steam charts, it gets about on average 300 plus players a month, which is not good, especially for a Battle Royale game. But it is free, and if you want a less serious Battle Royale game, then give this one a try and see for yourself. Grappling hooks are a popular feature in games, and they offer a lot of verticality and speed that can sometimes be euphoric, and it can also sometimes be silly, like Grapples Galore. It's a physics-based multiplayer arena game that is designed with ragdoll-based gameplay and grappling hooks in mind. Your character will flail through the entire map, webbing your way in order to reach the next opponent. It pretty much looks like a bar fight with guns, but the guys are passed out and the only thing moving them is a grappling hook. In saying that, I'll be waiting a while personally to play this one while it gets developed further, but since it's already free, you can try it out yourself and see what's already there. It just looks to be a simple but fun game that you can fuck around in with some friends, and while you can still do that in competitive games, it's much easier to do it in games that don't have competitiveness in mind. Again, it's up to the players to do that sort of thing in these type of games, even in something as ridiculous as this one and the game before it. In any event, it looks really fun, and I look forward to seeing its continual development. Now, if you want something that is a bit easier to get into, but still has a more traditional shooter environment to play in, well, Polybilisy looks to be that sort of game. Without sounding too often like a broken record, a lot of these games are fairly well optimized for low-end users. You won't necessarily need the beefiest rig to get the job done, just something good enough to run web-based applications. Also, a lot of these games have a more casual environment because they're a lot easier to pick up and play in comparison to their more competitive counterparts like, CS, Valorant, Apex, Warzone, names go on. Now that I've stalled for some time here, let's actually move on to the game. Believe it or not, this game is actually still in an alpha stage, and it is genuinely impressive for what it already offers to the table. The graphics are appealing in a low poly sense, there's a good amount of weapons and maps to play on. For those that do want to treat the game more competitively, you also have clans and leaderboards to go for as well. But it's entirely optional, and it doesn't reflect the entire experience you'll have in this game, unlike Counter-Strike or Valorant. The developer also has two other games called Rush Team and War Attack. I'll put both of these games as well in the description so you can check it out. It's very polished for an alpha game, and I would highly recommend you give this one a try. And if you don't like what you see, that's fine, because again, the game is still in alpha, the developer is still working on the project, and down the track it may become a lot better to convince you to try it again. This is a great choice for those that want something familiar, but not as stressful to play at the same time. Now we are heading unapologetically into Roblox territory, folks. A platform where kids have been the target audience and yet still has older people finding their place in the community. Arsenal is honestly worth the playtime, however, regardless of age. I don't care, this game is so fucking fun. The weapon variety is excellent. You always have something new to play with and there's a good amount of content to keep you going. A lot of people swear by this game, myself included, and for good reason, because when it comes to Roblox shooters, it is one of the best ones out there. Roblox is one of the most undervalued platforms when it comes to quality shooters because not a lot of other people would see themselves playing these games, especially when they already have a list of other popular titles in the competitive market. Arsenal, of course, does have its competitive side, but each match is so unique in terms of what you might get, and the premise is so fun that you can pop into any game and still have a good time regardless. The gunplay and the movement is great. It's hard to believe sometimes that it even is a Roblox game to begin with. In fact, I honestly think that it should be its own game at this point because of how well made it is. If you don't mind the fact that it's a Roblox game to begin with, then swallow your pride and get right into it because it is genuinely one of the best games on there and arguably one of the best multiplayer shooters that I've played. Browser games have come a long way compared to what we had back in the 2000s. While they're not close to what AAA or indie games bring to the table, they still have their own place and the quality has been increasing each year. Deadshot.io is somewhere in the middle in this case. It's a pretty simple game with only 4 weapons to use, and each one isn't that hard to use. You have a few different maps and game modes, and matches are pretty easy to get into like most of the browser games that I've seen and played lately. The game does have some YouTubers that cover the game and even have some guides, but for a first time player you won't really have that much trouble getting into the experience. Movement is relatively simple with a sliding mechanic and the weapons feel pretty easy to handle. For those that have come from games like Krunker.io, it also has skins and a prize wheel system. But what skins you get depends on your luck, and to get more skins you need currency which you can earn from playing the game and completing challenges over the time. Out of all of the games on this list, this is probably the easiest one to get into, and it can be a fun time still. It's sort of like an early browser game but with a bit more polish, and I actually like that, to be honest. It's not the best looking game, of course, but when you're playing browser-based games, you do have to be a little bit more realistic about your expectations. For those that are newer to multiplayer shooters and want something simpler, I would recommend giving this one a try. Now, in contrast to Deadshot.io, we have a more advanced game to show here, Eve.io. Eve.io is a browser-based multiplayer shooter that's a mix of Quake, Halo, and Destiny. Has starting loadouts and weapons you can pick up on the map, as well as abilities to use. Out of some of the IO FPS games that I've tried, this is one of the more impressive ones in my opinion. The movement feels really good in this game. The weapon ability variety makes for some potential weapon and movement tech that can be developed over time if you really want to get into it. If you've come from some of those games that I just mentioned, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what this game is like. It does also have NFTs tied into it, which I don't really know anything about, so I'm not going to get into it. But people getting into this game for the first time more than likely won't really worry about it initially. It has a variety of game modes to enjoy, even having a third-person camera if you want to change your perspective. In terms of polish, this is probably one of the best browser-based shooters that I've seen and have played since Krunker.io, and it's made by a company that has been a household name for over a decade in browser-based gaming. Eve.io is a great choice for those that want a good mix of Halo, Destiny, and Quake put into a browser blender. But if you don't like the sci-fi aesthetic, or are more into slower paced team shooters like Counter-Strike, then I wouldn't recommend it. Otherwise, have at it. Finally, we are turning back the clock once again, and this will be the last one for this video. Lights, camera, action, Quake 2. Yep, that's right. This was originally Quake 2 of all things, and it was pretty awesome for its time. Now, on the one hand, this may be one of the harder games to get into on this list because most people who remember it and still play it are long-time veterans at this game, and if you're versing them, then you're going to have a pretty rough time. But on the other hand, I still recommend this game anyways because it's also a reflection of an older time when multiplayer games weren't necessarily made to be competitive in the same way they are now. Sure, there were Quake tournaments back then, but not everyone was competing for John Carmack's Ferrari. Most people were just learning the game, fragging, having fun at the same time, and that's what a lot of these games have in common, being made to have fun. Competitive gaming in the long term is a result of player investment, by developing muscle memory, game knowledge, and raw aim within the game itself, and developing weapon movement tech, game sense, new strategies, things like that. That's what eventually culminates into a more competitive game in the long run. These games, however, do still have those competitive aspects, but they also, they also have enough room for casual players. which is why these games are mentioned in this list. Now with Action Quake 2, it's not exactly the same as Quake 2 itself. Not many people know about this game. In fact, not that many people know that the people who made Counter-Strike also worked on this game. Counter-Strike would be a more realized version of some of the elements that this game had, the present day setting, the higher time to kill, and the use of recoil in the weapons. But it still had some of the fast-paced movement of Quake 2, and it still went for the deathmatch-based gameplay that was enjoyed in Quake's multiplayer. I have a video for this game as well, and I'll put it in the description for anyone that's interested. The game is free on Steam, and people still play it, although not that many. However, you do have bots that are pretty customizable, and is an easier way of getting acquainted with the game's mechanics and gunplay. It's a pretty unique game with a cool setting, and is a game that will give you a deeper appreciation for Counter-Strike due to its connection with it. And that's all she wrote for this video. There are many more that I could talk about, but there are more casual-based multiplayer experiences out there than how much time I have in the day, so I'll be revisiting this subject with new suggestions in the future. In any event, these games have a more casual approach to the multiplayer experience that still has some room for both casual and competitive players. They don't necessarily have the same issues that games like Valorant or other competitive-based games have, where it's played competitively no matter which mode you play, which is bad for those that treat the game more casually and don't really care what they're doing, and then start to care when things go wrong. These games, in contrast, are more relaxed in comparison. Even Action Quake 2, with some of its decade-long players, is still a more casual sort of experience because you're just playing the game to have fun, and that's what everyone in the game is sort of doing. Sure, there are people that sweat it out, but that's just due to years of experience. I've gone into these games very briefly and haven't covered everything, but I hope I've said enough to interest you in trying these games out, especially if you're retreating from the competitive field that we find ourselves in today. I personally don't give a shit whether the game is competitive or casual. If it's fun, I'll enjoy it. It's that simple. I find these games to be fun. Some of them I haven't played look fun, and maybe you'll find it fun too.